Welcome to Militant Clean Capitalism. This is Josh, and I am here today. We're talking with organizers from Lowcountry Action Committee, Black African grassroots organization dedicated to Black liberation through service, political education, collective action in the Lowcountry of South Carolina. We begin by giving a space for the organizers to introduce themselves, share the work that they do, and reflect on their journey organizing in the region. Our conversations moved into their 2024 piece on environmental racism, where they traced the climate catastrophe threatening to wash away Gullah Geechee homelands back to the phosphate mining industry of the 1860s. We discuss how today's disproportionate exposure of Black communities to hazardous waste sites, landfills, incinerators is inseparable for the region's history of chattel slavery, and why Black people must be at the vanguard of the environmental movement. We then situate the crisis within the broader context of the Black Belt, a historical homeland of Africans trafficking to North America, now among the most vulnerable regions to climate change. Drawing on Kali Akuno's prediction that large portions of the Black Belt may be underwater by 2050, explore what displacement and housing costs and organized abandonment mean for Black communities in the Carolinas and beyond. The conversation also turns to international frameworks, particularly Cuba's model of sustainable development, and the parallels between Cuban soil erosion and sea level rise, and the ecological challenges facing Gullah Geechee communities. We discuss how the Lowcountry itself lives under a kind of economic blockade, and how this juxtaposition eliminates the enigma of environmental racism, neocolonialism, and anti-Blackness. If you like what we do, want to support our ability to have more conversations like this, please consider becoming a patron. You can do so for as little as $1 a month, bringing these conversations totally independently, no corporate state or grant funding. I would like to start by allowing you both the opportunity to introduce yourselves to our audience. Tell us a bit about the work you're doing and how long you've been at it. Anything else you would like to share as well.
All right. Well, thank you. My name is Erica, and I am a co-founding member of the Lowcountry Action Committee. And we are, like you said, a Black-led organization based in the South Carolina Lowcountry, dedicated to political education, service, and collective action in our communities. And so we kind of got started in 2020 in the summer, in the wake of the George Floyd protests. And we spent about 6 months just focusing on some internal political education before we stepped out with our first survival program, which was a food drive. We called it the Freedom Bag Food Drive. And we've actually been hosting that food drive for 3.5 years. Every third Saturday, we've never missed a Saturday. And we feed several families in the Lowcountry, in the Charleston, North Charleston area and surrounding areas. We have a lot of political education, public-facing teach-ins, and we have built lots of community partnerships with different institutions and other grassroots organizations in the community. And so I'll pass it over to my comrade Carl, so Carl can hop in.
Thanks, Erica, and thanks, Josh, for having us here. My name is Carl. I'm a more recent initiate of LAC. I joined last year, so relatively new to the organizing space. I like to say I'm an organizer in training, but I've been learning a lot from Erica and all of the other LAC members. Prior to that, I've just been working and surviving, living in South Carolina, born and raised in the Charleston Lowcountry area, so the singular member of the Gullah Geechee community, and a lot of the work surrounding lifting the Gullah Geechee community up, and it is where my passion resides and a lot of my focus is. So we'll keep it short and sweet, like that.
No, yeah, that's perfect. No problem. So you guys organize around a plethora of issues, but recently you published a piece discussing environmental racism in your specific context, where the consequences of climate catastrophe has seen, I'm quoting here, the sea level rise threatening to wash away our Gullah Geechee homelands, end quote. So this catastrophe in this specific context stretches back to what you describe as the emergence of the local phosphate mining industry in the 1860s, and has since had a disproportionate impact on working poor, namely Black residents, as it relates to environmental hazards. And you state that, I'm quoting here again, today Gullah Geechee communities disproportionately neighbor hazardous waste sites like landfills, sewage plants, and incinerators, and manufacturing facilities. Add to this gaping racial disparities rooted in the region's history of chattel slavery, and it becomes clear why Black people should be the vanguard of the environmental movement, end quote. So to begin the discussion, I would like to give you both space to discuss the historical context for the contemporary crisis in the Carolinas.
Okay, cool. I'll start, and then I'm going to pass it to Carl. So I'm going to take us all the way back. So just to acknowledge the fact that I'm in a part of Charleston right now that was historically Kiowa land of the Kiowa people. So Charlestown was founded in 1670 by the English. And within 20 or 30 years, it became a Black majority because they began trafficking in enslaved Africans to the area to grow rice. So this was a rice colony that a lot of people are not familiar with, but it was the richest colony in Charleston was the richest city in colonial America because of the rice that was grown by enslaved African people. And they were responsible for building the wealth, for the Carolina colony, and really laid the foundation for the development of this system of capitalist exploitation that we are currently struggling under. And so the Gullah Geechee culture developed out of that culture of Africans who were being trafficked to this coastal area that spans from Wilmington, North Carolina, all the way through South Carolina and Georgia's coast to around the Jacksonville, Florida area. So that's the historic Gullah Geechee cultural heritage area that coincides with the region where rice was grown. And so we talk about environmental racism and environmental hazards in the Gullah Geechee community today. They really started back then because after the Civil War, the rice industry pretty much bottoms out because if you have to pay workers to grow rice, then it's no longer really lucrative. And that's when you start to see the emergence of the phosphate mining industry. And it was largely centered around a lot of these former rice plantations. And I'll let Carl pick it up from there. So I know that's his baby.
The phosphate mining industry in South Carolina at its peak was the largest industry in South Carolina. And the main labor force was formerly enslaved African people. And I don't know how deep you want to go right now. Right now, we're just trying to discuss the historical context, but this was the beginning of just the industrialization period. And, early on, when it first started, phosphate mining in itself is just really, really, really strenuous work. I mean, all of it was done by hand, naturally, like many industries. As time progressed, they started incorporating like steam engines and different things like that. But primarily, it was just done by hand. And what inspired this article that Erica and I wrote was this area of Charleston is still predominantly African, and a lot of the EPA has identified that many of these sites along the Ashley River, like Erica stated, used to be known as the Kiowa River. It's like these sites are contaminated, the soil is contaminated, and there's still actually a company that is a fertilizer manufacturing plant. So they were mining the phosphate to manufacture plant fertilizer, which was in high demand back then. Agriculture was still one of the dominant industries in South Carolina, even though phosphate mining was growing and fertilizer manufacturing was growing. There was a high demand for fertilizer, so it was just a high demand for it. And the fact that, as you stated, you quoted from our article that all of the neighborhoods surrounding these areas are still predominantly Black. The EPA has came in and cleaned up some of the sites, but there hasn't been a lot of attention paid to the how bad the contamination is, what's the effects of the people living there, still living right next to the plant. The fact that there is still an active fertilizer manufacturing plant in the North Charleston area, a little area known as the Neck, and what that means for the people still living there. And we were really just inspired to, in an attempt for us at LAC to prioritize or just center a lot of our work in just the environmental movement and environmental racism. We just want to inspire not only just Gullah Geechee people, but African people, period, to take seriously the environmental concerns going on right now in the world at large, and pretty much inspire them to, realize that this movement, it is directly affecting us. I think the environmental movement historically has like there's like a stereotype for what people who are environmentalists or like the white hippies, it's kind of like what it's marketed as or advertised as. But we were directly involved in a lot of the because Gullah Geechee people are people that live off the land. We were brought here because we were agriculturalists. We knew how to live off the land, and our cultural practices allowed us to survive in this area. And we want people to realize that, the Gullah Geechee people to realize, period, that without the land, we have nothing, right? And our culture is still very much tied to the land. And if we don't tap into the environmental struggle, or we don't essentially take charge of the movement and realize how important it is that our culture is also rested.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I appreciate you bringing that up because I was actually leading into our next question. And I would love to hear Erica's thoughts on this as well. But yeah, in the article, you know how Kali Akuno, someone we've had on the show before, predicts that, and I'm quoting here, by 2050, the large portions of the Black Belt will be underwater if the predictions of the environmental scientists are accurate, end quote. But what you write in your article, the Black Belt refers to a crescent-shaped strip of fertile land in the southeastern United States, which has historically been home to an almost unbroken chain of majority or near majority Black counties, stretching from Virginia to East Texas. It is the historic homeland of Africans trafficked to North America to build the wealth of this nation during the transatlantic slave trade, where the majority of their descendants still live today. According to Akuno, the land millions of Africans in North America currently occupied is some of the most vulnerable to climate change, and as such, Black people are more likely to be displaced as a result of climate change, induced natural disasters. The rising cost of housing means finding new homelands for ourselves may prove insurmountable task, which is why our stake in the environmental movement is so high, end quote. So let's focus a bit on the specific context of the Black Belt, a term that is almost exclusively used by radical left-leaning Black nationalists in its relationship to the climate crisis. One of the reasons I wanted to discuss this piece with you guys in particular is because I lived in North Carolina for about 16 years and still have family there and spent a lot of my time there. And I've seen both in North Carolina and South Carolina working class and poor people, namely those who are racialized, who have been disproportionately victimized by organized abandonment on behalf of the state, specifically as it relates to environmental issues, namely as it relates to land, water, and natural resources. Yet it goes widely underreported, nationally speaking. But you guys discussed the importance of Black people immersing themselves or ourselves in the struggle on matters regarding ecology and the environment at large. So if you can, talk about this a bit.
Yeah. Well, we were super inspired by, so Kali Akuno, you said you've had him on the show before. Well, one of our comrades in the Lowcountry Action Committee, Salifu, he hosted Hood Communist for a few years. And so he invited Kali Akuno to an episode of Hood Communist to speak about Cooperation Jackson. And so I just happened to be listening to some old Hood Communist episodes, and I got to the Kali Akuno one, and I was super inspired. I mean, he talked about a lot of things over the course of the episode, but he spent, 20 or 30 minutes talking about the environment and the importance of Black people taking the lead in the environmental movement. And so I was super touched, moved by it. And the Lowcountry Action Committee, we're a part of several local, national, and international organizations. So we're part of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. We are a part of the National Network on Cuba. We are a part of the Black Alliance for Peace. And then locally, we co-founded the Charleston People's Budget Coalition, as well as we're a part of the Charleston Climate Coalition. And so, we've worked with the Charleston Climate Coalition through our work in the Charleston People's Budget Coalition. And then we have formally joined a CCC, I think last year, maybe the year before. They were a fiscal sponsor for us before we established our nonprofit wing. And so, we were kind of like unofficially connected with the Charleston Climate Coalition, and they, would invite us to speak at some of their events. And we always tried to say yes, because they were super supportive of us when we were, transitioning to trying to get our nonprofit going so that we can get, more funding for our organization. And so this year, as a part of our planning retreat for the year, we got some new members because we've always been a pretty small organization. We've had like 8 to 10 active members. And so this past year when we had our new member cohort come through, we had some more folks, we're starting to expand. So I'm like, I really want to dedicate a person or two to the Charleston Climate Coalition so that we can really be more active in that organization, because I do think they're doing important work. And so we have this comrade named Victoria. So I was like, Victoria, do you want to be the LAC Coalition rep? And so Victoria goes to a Charleston Climate Coalition meeting. She comes back, she reports back. She's like, Erica, what did you send me to? And she's basically commenting on the fact that she is the only Black face in this room of these white hippie people that we tend to associate with climate activists. And so Kali Akuno, when I heard his piece in Hood Communist, he talked about that. He talked about the fact that there are these stereotypes when it comes to climate activists, but the real importance of Black people joining this movement, because our lands are the most vulnerable. We are the ones who are going to be displaced if and when these worst case scenarios when it comes to the climate catastrophe come to pass. And so I was so touched by that. I was like, hey, I want to share this with the rest of the group. So at our upcoming meeting, I offered to lead a political education segment, which is a part of all of our meetings. And so I played this 20-minute clip from the interview, and to my pleasant surprise, everybody was really feeling it. And I was like, y'all, this really inspired me. Carl was one of the people that was really inspired by it as well. And so this was a few weeks before Earth Day. And there was also this kind of thing going on in North Charleston around this, environmental, this hazardous site that they're trying to develop next to our communities. And so Kali Akuno really inspired us to start taking climate action more seriously and to try to take a lead in some of the local climate coalitions that we have in our community, because, we are the ones that are bearing the brunt of climate change. And while these white activists, in a lot of cases, their heart is in the right place, they have the means to leave and move to higher ground if they need to. Our communities are going to be the ones that are left to pick up the pieces. We've seen that time and time again when our cities getting flooded out, when our public housing units are getting flooded out. We saw it in the aftermath of Katrina. So we know what to expect in terms of the lack of support for the Black community in the aftermath of a natural disaster and a climate-induced natural disaster. So, it's really important that we take the lead in these movements. And so the Lowcountry Action Committee is really new to this. Like I said, we just this is all happening in the last few months. We listened to this clip during one of our meetings that I facilitated. Then Earth Day was right around the corner. Carl went and attended this community meeting in North Charleston around this hazardous site that they're trying to develop next to this historically Black neighborhood. And then Earth Day comes around, and we just decide to put this article together in 48 hours and drop it. And we've received a lot of really positive feedback as a result of it. So we're very new to trying to figure out how we can make climate change and climate activism a priority within the Lowcountry Action Committee.
Yeah, and I can add to that. So my hesitation at first when you asked the question, because there's so much to talk about.
Absolutely.
But so something that I had this realization. Well, I learned this, right? I've seen it for years, but I didn't really make the connection as LAC was studying the Black Belt region. The manufacturing industry, this hyper-industrialization here in America, all throughout the Black Belt, there's a lot of manufacturing companies, automotive manufacturing. Some of the biggest car manufacturers in the world have plants in the South. And like I said, it's in the Black Belt region around a lot of Black communities. And we just, a lot of times, the way corporate America, or just America, essentially how they've always seen African people was just like a labor force. So every time a manufacturing plant comes into an area, they talk about how grateful, we should be that we now have access to these jobs and how our lives are going to be so much better. We leveled a couple 100 acres of this forest to build this plant. And the entire narrative around manufacturing coming to the South or just coming to the areas. It's kind of structured around just how it's going to just improve our lives financially. But we don't talk about the environmental hazards, the contamination, the pollution that comes along with it, and that could be in the form of runoff, contaminating the soil, contaminating the water, also just with the air pollution, right? And to your point in your question, you just said like a long time it went unreported. Like no one really, if we don't organize and talk about it, and how we've already seen when we weren't organizing and talking about it, people weren't talking about it. And Erica brought up the situation here locally in Charleston, where a former fertilizer manufacturing site is, it was abandoned for years. They built up after the fertilizer plant got tore down. There was a hospital there. Then the hospital got tore down, and just all throughout that area is just contaminated soil. And they're looking to build another manufacturing plant there. And this time, the meeting that we went to, right? This company tried to come in, and they lied about how they got community feedback. They might have talked to like 5 to 10 people. Some of those are, they come in, they'll hire consultants to come into the area and trying to sway the local people to want to get on board. But what happened is they were very low key about it, even though they swear they were so public and they were in the community asking for everyone's feedback. They got towards the time where they wanted to get the land rezoned to like heavy industrial, and the community really showed up, like the Black community really showed up at the meeting. We pretty much, like, we raised a lot of hell about, we don't want more manufacturing plants in this area. Like, people are tired of living next to these plants. So, for example, the plant that I was telling you about, it's like a German fertilizer manufacturing plant still in operation. They've recorded over 20 spills over the last couple of decades since the 90s, where back in the 90s, they even had an explosion where like 9 people died. But they have a well-documented history of releasing chemicals into the environment. A lot of those times, they're not even effectively alerting the local community that is happening. Or, they get really particular with these laws with DHEC. If they don't spill a certain amount, it doesn't qualify to alert people. And, so they play these games. It always favors the company. It always favors the people who are doing the harm to the land, to the environment. And it's almost like the government wants to make it easier for them to do that and harder for the people to fight for themselves and fight for the environment. So it's really important that we get ahead of this as a people. And I think just the overland industrialization period, and how African people, just in the Gullah Geechee community specifically, a lot of us went from living off the land strictly, growing our own food, relying on the land for natural herbs and medicine, and going to the creeks and fishing, and all of these practices that we brought with us from West Africa. For a long period of time, Gullah people got away from that style of living. And here recently, it's almost like a resurgence. Like, people are wanting to tap back into what it really, really means to be Gullah. And though a lot of it is like romanticized, and it's for like trying to profit, because for some strange reason, like, Europeans love coming to Charleston to so they can just be immersed in what like the pretty much like the remnants of this slave culture. I mean, just to put it plainly. And so I think it's important that we have to bring this thing full circle. And if we're going to have a revolution around tapping back into being or just being really Gullah, living off the land, we have to protect the land. We have to fight for the land. And right now in Charleston, South Carolina is like the number 1 state in America that people are moving to right now. And I'm pretty sure Charleston is really high on that list. And the land is under attack. The land is getting really crazy in the Charleston area. And because North Charleston is the 2 of the Black cities in the state of South Carolina, I think we are in a unique position that if we can inspire Black people to organize around environmental issues, it's I think Erica said it best, it always falls on us to clean up the mess. It's a real opportunity. And like Erica said, we've been inspired and we really want to just push environmental justice really big from LAC and just get all Black people in the area to just join us in this fight.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that from both of you. And I'm skipping around here a little bit, but you guys said something about natural disasters. I think you both kind of alluded to something regarding like getting ahead of it, right? And I'm thinking about one of the reasons why I kind of like affirmed my socialist politic. I think was seeing a couple of years ago. I think pretty sure it was during like Trump's presidency. But it was a hurricane that happened, and I think Cuba or was coming to Cuba, and we saw the state respond in a way that was proactive. Right, we saw the state like in cahoots with the citizens, right, of Cuba, evacuate people, like give folks resources and things like that. And it was a corroborative effort, right, to make sure that we, even though something as, again, natural that happens, like a hurricane, right, that they were going to try to lessen the harm or the death that comes from that, you know? And so in this article, you highlight how Cuba, right, which is a largely African nation, or island, I should be precise, offers a framework we can learn from as it relates to sustainable development in the face of pending ecological destruction. So I would just love to hear your thoughts on some of the things that Cuba has adopted that you see as translatable to other regions, namely that of the Black Belt.
Yeah, Cuba, we get a lot of inspiration from Cuba. Like I said, we're members of the National Network on Cuba. We send people to Cuba every year as a part of the Mayday Brigade and other brigades. And so I've been to Cuba once, but many of our members in the Lowcountry Action Committee have been 10, 15 times. So as a part of that, one of the first times that we were able to collaborate with the Charleston Climate Coalition on a program, which was called Black and Green, we actually did a viewing of Cuba's Life Task, which is a documentary by Dr. Helen Yaffe about Cuba's response to climate change. And so Cuba is the only country on the entire globe to meet the World Wildlife Federation's standards for sustainable development. And so Cuba basically came up with this plan. They adopted it, I think, in 2017, and it's going to take them all the way to the year 2100 to mitigate the effects of climate change on the island. And so Cuba is an island nation, like you said, largely African, because most of the Europeans, the Cubans of European descent fled the island back in the 50s and 60s. So they have, as a part of Cuba's Life Task, which is, the documentary is on YouTube, but in Spanish it's Tarea Vida. So as a part of Tarea Vida, they have, obviously, sustainable development is really important. The way that they develop in the coastal areas is very important. They are, there's tasks involved that are centered on restoring coastland, restoring their coral reefs. They have plans in place to relocate people who may be displaced from coastal areas as a result of climate change, climate-induced natural disasters, etc. They have adopted certain crops that are going to be more heat tolerant because Cuba's climate is changing from tropical to like semi-arid as a result of climate change. And so they're having to pivot to the types of crops that they can grow. And so a lot of the things that are involved, and I'm no expert on Cuba's Life Task. This has just been, what I've learned about Cuba in regard to its response to climate change has come from just being able to be in community with local Black organizers who have been to Cuba, who are, chairs in and co-chairs in the National Network on Cuba. And so I'm no expert. I've watched the documentary a couple of times, and I follow Dr. Helen Yaffe on Twitter. But so, if you're interested, I would highly suggest that you watch the documentary and, Google Cuba's Life Task or Google Tarea Vida Cuba, and just kind of see for yourself some of the things that they've implemented. But here in the Lowcountry, we are struggling because of, sustainable development. We need that like yesterday. Cuba, like so many people talk about what we need to do to mitigate the effects of climate change, but nobody's doing it. They're continuing to develop regardless of the impact that it's having on the environment. So one thing that Cuba has done is they not only are they developing sustainably, but they have connected very clearly the climate catastrophe to its root source, which is capitalism and overconsumption and consumerism. And so I think that's very important because they're not talking around the problem. They've identified the issue and they've come up with top to bottom and bottom to top ways to address it. And obviously they've been very successful at it. You know, from the highest level of government to the most grassroots level of the community, everybody's involved in Cuba's life task Inseparable. And so here in the Lowcountry, we can learn a lot from that. Like our communities are underwater. Some years in Charleston, we're underwater 100 days out of the year. There's days where I can't go to work because the area where my job is located floods really bad. Like I have had to leave work because of a flash flood and had water go over the top of my car trying to find a safe way off the Charleston Peninsula. And this happens all the time. And I don't live on the peninsula, so if I can get out or can, get enough notice to not go down there, I can. But there are people who live down there, even though it's being aggressively gentrified and, our historic Black communities in the heart of Charleston are being pushed out. But there are still some little Black enclaves, and those are the most vulnerable to flooding in the area. And, they're dealing with, our community members are dealing with mold issues. They're dealing with their apartments in their houses being flooded out, property damage, having to dredge through raw sewage when the streets get flooded, having to miss work because of flooding, because of medical, related issues related to having to, dredge through raw sewage. And so we're just left to kind of deal with the pieces, to pick up the pieces when we are dealing with these catastrophes. Cuba is very proactive about it, and they have plans in place to actually take care of people who have been the victim of these kinds of natural disasters and climate-induced catastrophes in a way that the government in Charleston just does not do. Like, they cater to tourists, and that's it. They develop, like Carl said, we've got 50 to 100 people moving into the Charleston area every day. There's an affordable housing crisis, and they're filling in marshlands and putting up high-rise apartment complexes and raising the cost of rent. But more importantly, interrupting the natural systems, in the Lowcountry by filling in these marshlands and streets. The area is still gonna flood. It's still gonna hold water historically, like it always did. The water just doesn't have a natural place to go. And so instead of going into a marsh, going into a coastal estuary, now it's just flooding into the streets. It's flooding into parking lots. It's flooding into people's houses when we have these high tides or these flash floods or these tropical storms blowing through. And our community is the most susceptible to that because we already are getting priced out of the city of Charleston. And then we losing the few little properties that we're trying to, clutching onto. When they get flooded out, we can't afford, to rebuild.
Yeah, I want to add to that. So, Eric mentioned about Cuba being intentional about just restoring their coastlines, just to keep my little, what I call my baby, the phosphate industry, just to keep making those connections. Scientists knew about the phosphate deposits in South Carolina like a while ago, like in the 1700s. There were river mining, and there was like land mining. And what they did to the marshes and the waterways and the coastlines all along the Ashley rivers and the Cooper rivers and the Stono rivers and the other handful of rivers down in Beaufort that I'm forgetting right now, but all up and down the coast. And so it wasn't just Charleston. And that's why we keep saying the Gullah Geechee communities all along the coast of South Carolina. When these plantation owners realized that they were in this unique position because a lot of the plantations were near the rivers, that they were in this, and after slavery ended, a lot of those guys were going into debt. They didn't know what to do. And so they were desperately digging for the phosphate. They destroyed the marshes. They destroyed the coastlines, even more inland in those land phosphate mines, just constantly digging and just destroying the soil. Our coastlines need that kind of initiative. Like Erica said, Cuba was intentional about rebuilding their coastlines. South Carolina has not seriously accept the responsibility for what they allowed to happen during the phosphate industry. And it was only 20 years. That's one of the things that I learned about it that's so crazy to me. Is in that 20 years, they put their foot on the gas and they did the most. All of the damage they did was just like a 20-year span. And we have not seriously addressed how damaged our marshes are, how much we've destroyed the coastlines, and we need to pay attention to that and to restore these areas is another priority, because a lot of these areas are still predominantly Black. I don't know, but that's even just more justification for Black people to prioritize it, and the reason why we've been seriously researching the phosphate industry so deeply, doing the research and finding ways that we can just package that information and start incorporating it into our political education sessions, because I think the more we educate people, the more we show them how this area has been done so wrong, how we were the ones that were used to do it. We were living next to these plants, and we need to, using Cuba as a model, I think it's a wonderful connection that Erica made, that we have to pay attention to it and identify the root cause as capitalism. There was no second thought about what would this do to the environment if we take 10,000. I think the Charleston, one of the largest phosphate manufacturing companies, or the phosphate mining and fertilizer manufacturing companies, the Charleston Mining Company, they accumulated over 10,000 acres along the Ashley River, and they just started digging and digging and digging and sending Black people to the bottom of the river to dig up rocks and land mining sites, just digging with no regard for the environment and how it was going to play into just long term. And it was recently where, and another reason why we need to get involved is because these companies, like ExxonMobil, paid out $6 or $7 million to the South Carolina government to rebuild the marshes. We have to be on top of that. I haven't seen any marshes being rebuilt. I'm not saying they're not doing it, but I think it's important that we stay close to this and make sure that, that we do the work necessary to restore our coastlines, because like I said, it's our home and we're at risk.
I want to jump back in. Thank you, Carl. You always bring it back home. But I would be remiss. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that Cuba has developed this very effective response to climate change. All of this has taken place while being under this unjust and deadly U.S. economic blockade. So Cuba has been under blockade since 1961, I believe. It's the longest standing blockade in global history. And recently, under the Trump administration, Cuba was added to the state sponsor of terrorism lists. And so Cuba is the socialist capital of the Western Hemisphere. And they have shown time and time again that they put people before profits, right? They are a very people-centered nation. And they have, revolutionized medicine, sending Cuban doctors all over the world. They've revolutionized the educational campaigns, eradicated illiteracy. So they get a lot of attention for their doctors, but they don't get attention oftentimes for some of the other just amazing contributions to the world that they have contributed. And so it's really important. There's so much we can learn from them about the climate and their response to climate change, but because the blockade is in place, it makes things so much more difficult. And our government, the United States government, not my government, but the U.S. government, they look at Cuba as a threat because it's a socialist country, because it puts people first, because it's an example of what life could be like if we had, for people in the United States, people in the belly of the beast, if we had access to universal education, if we had access to universal health care, if we prioritized, sustainable development. And the U.S. government sees that as a threat and puts all of these blocks in place to try to starve out Cuba, to intimidate people from the United States from traveling to Cuba to learn about all the innovations that Cuba has contributed to the world while living under this deadly blockade. And so, we could learn so much more from Cuba if the information was able to flow back and forth freely. Cuba is the closest Latin American country to us in the United States. It's 90 miles off the coast of Florida. It's the closest Latin American country to the Gullah Geechee cultural heritage area. But we have to jump through all these hoops, just to be able to go there and learn from Cuban people. And so I definitely would encourage people to visit Cuba, whether it's on the Mayday Brigade, the Venceremos Brigade, the Pastors for Peace Brigade, or any other brigade. Take much needed, supplies. Anytime you do plan a trip to Cuba, take supplies to the island because, it's really, and connect with people on the ground in Cuba. There's a lot of Afro-Cuban organizers who are doing amazing work and who will receive, our delegations. And so it's important that we support them. White Cubans, they oftentimes have relatives that are already in the United States that they can get resources from on a regular basis. But Black Cubans are a lot less likely to leave the island. And so they're a lot less likely to have people, abroad who are able to send them stuff. So it's really important that we take medical supplies and we take, just everyday stuff. We're talking, go to the hair store, get a couple packs of braiding hair, get makeup, just everyday stuff, nail polish remover. Like, people need stuff, and the stuff that we bring to Cuba, it helps sustain them to continue to be doing this really important work that they've done in all these various areas, especially the environment.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you highlighting that, both of you, honestly. But you also draw another parallel around the climate crisis between Cuba and the Gullah Geechee communities in South Carolina, the Lowcountry, specifically with the soil erosion and sea level rise. But you also state that Lowcountry is similarly living under something of a form of economic blockade. I would just love for you both to kind of elaborate on this juxtaposition, if you will.
Yeah. There's been a lot of documents that have been declassified from the U.S. government in terms of the impact that they want the blockade to have on the Cuban people, because they'll tell you that, it only affects the government, but the U.S. economic blockade against Cuba, it impacts people on the ground in Cuba. It impacts everyday Cuban people when they don't have access to, just basic necessities, whether it could be, non-perishable items, toiletries, medication, syringes, just not being able to get money, from relatives abroad. It affects people's ability to live. And the U.S. government is doing this in hopes that by starving the Cuban economy and the Cuban people, that Cubans will rise up and overthrow their socialist government so that the U.S. can install a puppet government that's going to support the U.S. foreign policy in Cuba. And that hasn't happened, and it's probably not going to happen. But the situation, in Cuba, it is becoming dire. And there are parallels between Cubans living under blockade and Africans in America living under blockade. I mean, we don't have access to basic things that we need in our communities. So for the Lowcountry Action Committee, there's a foundational document that's been really important to the work that we do. And it's called, we call it the Disparities Report. But the official title is The State of Racial Disparities in Charleston County, South Carolina from 2000 to 2015. And it was published in 2017 by the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture. They have a race and social justice initiative. And so the Disparities Report basically lays out disparities in Charleston County along racial lines in areas like income, housing, education, healthcare, policing. And it ties all of this back to the history of the area of slavery. Charleston was the largest slave port in North America. It connects it back to Jim Crow apartheid. It connects it back to the war on drugs, to mass incarceration, and to what we're dealing with today. It's aggressive ethnic cleansing in the form of gentrification of our historically Black communities. And so we know the disparities that Black people live under in the Lowcountry. We know that we are not making a livable wage. We know that we are more likely to be living next to these hazardous sites that are polluting our communities. We are less likely to have access to quality healthcare. We still have moms and infants dying in childbirth at disproportionately higher rates. We don't have access to quality childcare. Our schools are being underfunded. The Charleston County School District is a joke in a lot of ways. And that's a form of blockade, because none of that, it doesn't have to be that way. The United States government, the local government has intentionally defunded our communities. It has intentionally marginalized our communities so that we have to live like this. Cuba shows us, that even in spite of being under this blockade, they have, focused on putting people first and investing in people. You can get a free year. Education is free in Cuba from kindergarten all the way to PhD. Healthcare is free. I just had a fibroid surgery and it cost $50,000. I could have got it done in Cuba for free. And so there's definitely parallels between, the U.S. economic blockade against Cuba and the living conditions for Africans in America. We're like a colony within a colony, according to Kwame Ture and, Charles V. Hamilton and Black Power. The Black community is a colony within a colony. The Black Belt is our historic homeland. And so we're a colonized people. And oftentimes we don't think about, the impact of being a colonized people. We like Black people in the United States, we know that we deal with racism, but we don't always understand the class dynamic behind it. And I think if we understood that better, we would prioritize, connecting with places like Cuba and protesting the blockade and trying to get Cuba off the state-sponsored terrorism list so that we can learn from these types of governments and socialist governments and communities.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Carl, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, real quick. I believe I touched on it already. I just wanted to reiterate the fact that, West African people being brought here because of their close connection to the land and their knowledge of how to live off the land. And I think what we see in the Gullah Geechee communities, just outside of, I think the Gullah Geechee communities were guilty of isolating themselves to the point of not being tapped into what was going on in the government or not positioning themselves to sustain those self-sustaining communities. But you have a lot of Gullah Geechee people that just did not need, the grocery stores, even though they probably couldn't. A lot of them couldn't make it, or even the hospitals. I think it was intentional. The way they dismantled the Gullah Geechee communities was very intentional because that amount of self-sustainability was frowned upon. Like they wanted them to depend on them. And what we see now in the area that I'm from, specifically the lower end of North Charleston, the 29405 zip code has been designated as a food desert for a while now, well over 10 years when our last grocery store left. And I just think it's ironic to me that people who historically lived off the land and grew their own food and, fish for their own food, forage for their own food, are now in a position where it's been made close to impossible to actively practice their culture. I mean, we're talking like that same zip code that I just said to you. The EPA also identified that zip code as, the soil being so contaminated due to the industrial companies coming in with their contamination, and people having a higher risk of developing cancer or asthma living in that area. But now the fact that we don't even have access to just affordable grocery stores and food is and almost being trapped, right? I mean, because how do you get your food? One, if you don't make the wages, the necessary wages to afford the food, but then even having access to an actual grocery store, or agriculture as an industry being minimalized so much that we have more manufacturing plants than we do have farms, and it's like communities who historically grew their own food and fed themselves and relied on the land. The fact that the land is being intentionally or just being neglected and contaminated on tailing of that to just not have grocery stores available to the people in the area is, kind of putting people in a very, very, very bad position. And okay, that's all I was going with that. Just listening to just the fact that Cuba prioritizes people over profit. I think for a long time, profit was the main concern, and the people were not. The people were just looked at as a not so important labor force. And right now, I think we need to inspire people. I keep going back to that because the motivation is to inspire people to organize and understand that we need the land. The land sustains us. It has always sustained us. Our knowledge and our relationship to the land is important.
Yeah, awesome. I appreciate that. Kind of shifting gears just a little bit. North Charleston is a mostly Black city with a Black mayor. I want to talk a bit about the crisis of neocolonialism that we see almost universally plaguing the lives of Black Africans worldwide, but in this case, specifically across the U.S. And there's currently a water crisis in Atlanta, or as famously known as the Black Mecca, for example. So I just want to discuss, how do you both see this crisis in relation to a wider national crisis, or better yet, an international one?
Well, it's interesting because North Charleston had a white mayor for like 40 years, Mayor Keith Summey. Thank God he's gone. We just got a Black mayor in North Charleston, and I live in the city of Charleston, so I don't live in North Charleston. I am one small, just across the bridge from North Charleston. So, and I do one of my side jobs is in North Charleston. But so yeah, North Charleston just got a Black mayor, and he was a cop. He was the police chief before he became the mayor.
The biggest cop.
Exactly.
That's nuts. I actually had no idea about that. I didn't know that. That's awful.
Right. He was I'm sorry, Erica. Yeah, he was
Go ahead.
He was a patrolman straight out of college. He worked himself up to being sergeant, all the different ranks. I'm not going to pretend that I care about the way police matriculate through their hierarchy, but he eventually, before he was appointed police chief, he was in charge of just a drug task force. He did a lot of collaborating with the DEA, ATF, and he was in charge of pretty much going into communities that he's from, because he's from the same area, the Alcobee community, the Union Heights community, the Libertyville community, all of these communities that we're talking about being located next to these whole conversations where he's from, and he was in charge of going into those communities and organizing with the federal government and locking people up, trying in their response to, fighting poverty. But sorry, Eric.
Gotcha. Yeah, he sounds awful, but yeah.
So just because we have a Black mayor in a majority Black city doesn't mean that the issues that the Gullah Geechee community and the growing Latino Hispanic community are facing are going to, magically evaporate. And that is part of the crisis of neocolonialism. It's still colonialism, it's just in blackface. And the power is still in the hands of capitalists, billionaires and millionaires who are buying and paying for our politicians. So, I'm not very hopeful that Reggie Burgess, the Black mayor of North Charleston, is going to do anything too radically to improve the lives of Black residents in North Charleston. So on April 18th, 2024, there was a community meeting about this site that we've been referencing. So that used to be a phosphate mining site that is a brown water site, so has some level of contamination in the ground. So it was purchased by the local Park and Recreation Commission. And they purchased the property with the promise of developing it into a waterfront park for the North Charleston community, the neighboring communities. And then suddenly they leased 11 acres to this boat manufacturing company who swear they say that the rent that they receive from this boat manufacturing is going to help them to develop this and clean up the site. And, Carl talked about how they came in and said they had all this community buy-in and talked about how they were going to bring jobs and whatnot. So they ultimately ended up, the city council tabled, so they had to apply to rezone the site to light and heavy industrial, which it had been zoned for residential since the 80s, to try to mitigate some of the environmental hazards of this highly contaminated zip code. And so the county park applied for this rezoning to industrial, which is where the controversy kind of came from. And then it was all exacerbated by the narrative pushed out by the boat manufacturer in trying to justify this change. And so there was a series of community meetings, and they did ultimately decide to withdraw the application. And I do believe that the mayor, the Black mayor of North Charleston, was on the side of the community in this particular issue. But I still am not hopeful that the conditions for Black people in North Charleston is going to change radically just because he happened to be on the right side. Even a broke clock is right twice a day.
Yeah. That's still to be determined in my opinion, because I recently discovered that he was against that vote coming there, but he was all for uh, a local university expanding their campus into North Charleston. But um, I really like this question because Atlanta being the Black Mecca, I've just recently learned about their water crisis. They're like I don't even know if the boil water advisory is still active, but people don't have people don't have clean water right now, and I think it's important because we talked about it already in this conversation about getting ahead of the situation. And another reason why I've been so inspired lately to speak on environmental issues and to instigate some kind of movement locally with the Black people here, because and you even said in your question, it's a great question about neocolonialism. North Charleston has been so happy and so hyped about having a Black mayor. This language has been going around. We can be the new Atlanta. You know, we're the blackest city in the state of South Carolina. This can be the new Black Mecca. And the prevailing, the most popular conversation around North Charleston right now, all the Black people here are so excited about making money, getting rich, taking advantage of the fact that, you know, a lot of our families are from this area. We own land here. You know, we can really, 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 really make a lot of money. And we're like gun ho in this fight to just be these Black capitalism. And there's little to no organizing Black people in North Charleston to stop and consider maybe we should not be so excited about being known as a Black Mecca financially. You know, could we be a Black Mecca, especially because of our Gullah Geechee culture and the fact that we historically and just generationally have this strong connection to the land. What message we could send to Atlanta, the Black Mecca, or to just nationwide to Black communities, that you don't have to, the answer to our problems does not have to be joining our oppressors in their exploitation of the environment and their journey to just amass as much resources as possible and with no regard for the environment. So yeah, I think now, like Erica said, he just became mayor in January. He hasn't been mayor that long. If we can get ahead of this, if we can steer the conversation away from being the next Atlanta, being a Black Mecca, we can stop and consider an alternative, starting with holding the government accountable for what they allowed to happen with the phosphate industry, or not even just that, with the contamination from the huge military bases in Charleston, the Port Authority, a really big paper mill that operated in Charleston for a long time. They're finally closing, but people here locally have known about the contamination in the waterways for a while. But due to you can call it desperation or just us practicing our culture, we still fish these waters. I mean, some people think it's crazy that Gullah Geechee people still fish in Charleston. They still fish in North Charleston. And but yeah, I think we have a unique opportunity to steer the conversation away, and it's going to be tough because people are very excited about having a Black mayor. We have a Black mayor, but we also have a majority Black city council. So, like you said, like the water crisis in Atlanta right now, Atlanta always talks about being a Black Mecca, how Black people can come there and get so much money, and you know, like here it is, a life-sustaining resource that has been neglected, right? I think it's just it's a wonderful example for us to look at, so for us to take seriously how we're, like, what issues we're prioritizing. Are we prioritizing our profit? Are we prioritizing getting rich? Are we prioritizing healing our relationship to the land and just being intentional about helping restore the land? And then, I mean, I think obviously, you know, isn't Flint like a majority Black city also?
Yes, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, Flint is very Black, and it's the same. I don't know about the economic side, but just the fact that, imagine if Black people were organizing in Flint around environmental issues, and they were,
Jackson, Mississippi.
Yeah, I really love this question, because I think this question in itself is inspiring me, because it almost makes me want to go harder with what we're trying to do in LAC, which is educate people on why environmental justice should be prioritized by Black people, and why we should be leaders in the movement. Why we should be leaders in the movement, because right now there's this false sense of hope with this Black mayor and this predominantly Black city with this Black city council, and how we can all just get rich and we can all fix our problems by just going all in on
selling ourselves to the highest bidder.
Yeah. So that's how I feel about that. So I think we can learn from Atlanta. We can learn from not fall for that false narrative. Ground ourselves in caring for the environment and respecting our environment.
Absolutely. But one of the main things that I was most excited talking to you both about is like the actual organizing work you are all doing, right? The type of strategies that you're employing and or the types of work that you aspire to do as well. So maybe if you can discuss a bit how you imagine others, whether locally or in their own regions, can involve themselves in struggle against similar structures of organized abandonment and domination. And also maybe just talk a bit about the specific things that you guys are taking up as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say it's really important for people to join these like revolutionary, radical organizations that are fighting for justice, and especially a way to tell if an organization is worth its salt is if they have a political education intake process. You know, organizations that do not have any type of established political education curriculum, I think that's a red flag in terms of the type of organization that it is. So join a revolutionary organization fighting for justice. That's the first thing that I would encourage anybody that wants to get involved in organizing in the climate, justice movement, environmental movement. Look for a radical organization that's fighting for justice. And if you can't find one in your area or you don't see one that aligns with your values, then create the organization that you want to be in. So yeah, I mean, LAC, we're pretty radical. It's interesting because I go back and forth about whether or not I consider myself an organizer or not, or sometimes I like to just say I'm an aspiring organizer, because I think that there is certain level of commitment to developing other people. There's a certain level of base building that is involved in organizing, and a certain level of political education. And sometimes I feel very confident about my where I am in that process, and other times I don't. But in terms of Lowcountry Action Committee, we said one of the main things that we're trying to do is raise the class consciousness of our community. And we've been such a small organization for so long. We've only just recently, started to get into the double digits in terms of membership. And so that has limited the amount of reach that we have in the community. So obviously we have our food drive, which has been going strong for 3.5 years. Every third Saturday, we give out fresh organic produce from a Black-owned organic farm in the area called Joseph Fields Farm, the only USDA organic farm in the Charleston area. So we give out really beautiful produce and non-perishable canned goods to our community members. And that program is basically, it runs itself. It's been going on so long and it's been very effective. We also host a lot of teach-ins. So we have James Campbell Learning Circle, and we host some really, really solid programs under the umbrella of the James Campbell Learning Circle. James Campbell was a native Charlestonian. He was a radical, revolutionary, Pan-African, Marxist, card-carrying communist educator who spent most of his educational career in Harlem and then went to Tanzania for 10 years and helped develop Tanzania before he came back and retired in Charleston. So we get a lot of inspiration from Mr. Campbell. I knew Mr. Campbell personally. And so we named our learning circle after him in his honor. And so we've posted teach-ins on, what is community control, African-American and Palestinian solidarity. Most recently, we have been hosting a Pan-African series. So we did a program about the Congo and the historical connections in the Gullah Geechee community to the Kingdom of Congo, and kind of brought it all the way home to what's going on in the Congo today. We just recently completed a program on the Sahelian Alliance, and just as a, Pan-African kind of goal for what it is that they're trying to do and how radical and revolutionary it is, and like what real post-colonial Africa can look like with the Alliance of Sahelian States as an example. And so our teach-ins have been really useful. I think they've been most useful with organizing and raising the political education of other community activists and organizers. In the coming year, I would like to see us base building more with some of the, historically Black communities that are still kind of holding out in the city of Charleston that haven't been, pushed off of the peninsula yet. So that's what I'm looking forward to in the coming years, but we've had some really dope initiatives. We've hosted summer camps in the past. We've applied recently for some grant funding to be able to, we've got a lot of interesting talents in the Lowcountry Action Committee. So for me, I'm an archivist, historian, and historical interpreter. So I lead tours and I train other people to lead tours. And so one of the things that I would love to see is, we've applied for grant funding for a heritage interpretation field school to try to train some up and coming, young Gullah Geechee folks in telling their own stories in the community, because this is a tourist capital of the world. Charleston has been the #1 tourist destination worldwide for over 10 years. And, whether people realize it or not, they're coming, like Carl has alluded to, people come to Charleston to experience Gullah Geechee history and culture, the language, the food, the architecture, the gardens. We built all of that. That's our culture that people are coming here to exploit. And South Carolina is making billions of dollars in the tourism industry by exploiting our history and culture. But oftentimes we are not the ones that are leading these tours, that are opening tour companies. And so the Heritage Interpretation Field School will be an opportunity for us to train our youth in interpretation, teach them, take them to local historic sites so that they can learn the history and how to share that history, so they can tap into some of those tourism dollars to try to close some of these disparities. We want to, fund some scholarships for vocational training, because again, using the disparities report as our guide, we know that these are things that are needed. Our young people need, access to quality education. They need training outside of the terrible school system that they're enrolled in. They need access to these professional skills and opportunities. So those are just some of the things that, that we have done or plan to do. Obviously, we want freedom for our people. We want an end to gentrification of our communities. We want our school system to actually have culturally competent curriculum. We want teachers in our schools that come from our communities. Obviously, we want community control of the police. We want housing for our people. We want access to healthy food. We want access to clean water. We want sustainable development in our community. We want to see some mitigation of the damage that has been done to our communities as a result of the climate catastrophe, overdevelopment, money-hungry developers. There's so many things that we want and that we organize toward in LAC.
I'm so big with snapping my fingers. I'm just thinking everything I could just say. I'm ready to add anything.
Well, I'll add and say we want to see a free and autonomous Palestine. We want to see Palestinians get their land back from the river to the sea. Yeah. We want to see the end of the deadly blockade, the U.S. economic blockade against Cuba. We want our students, we want our younger people to have, access to the skills and professional opportunities that they need. We want to see marijuana decriminalized in our community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. Thank you both so much for talking with me today. But before I let you go, I just want to give you the opportunity to tell listeners where they can find you online, how they can support both you as individuals, but also the work you're trying to do, and or how you would advise folks to, also get involved in the local working poor-driven political struggles in their areas.
All right, cool. Well, we're pretty much on every social media platform, LC Takes Action. That's also our email address. That's also our website, lctakesaction.com. That's also our Cash App and our Venmo. So if you want to donate to LAC, donate to our food drive. We're also collecting funds right now for our Black August Back to School drive, which is program that we're doing in collaboration with Charleston Black Lives Matter right now. So we love, folks to donate so that we can purchase some school supplies to make sure that our young people have what they need to enter into the next school year. We're also going to create some really cool materials to educate our young people around Black August. So yeah, donate to LAC, LC Takes Action. Follow us, join a revolutionary organization fighting for justice. And yeah, holler at us. We have to take over these movements. We have to develop our political consciousness so that we can improve the conditions in our community. We can't keep waiting on the powers that be that created the conditions that we're currently struggling under to change, right? To do something different. The system is operating exactly how they wanted to operate with us on the bottom, and with the climate and the planet as an afterthought. So we can't wait for people to make space for us. We have, just in the few months that we have been trying to prioritize taking the lead in the local and environmental struggle, we've experienced pushback. It's like Carl and I did a presentation, Victoria and I did a presentation a few weeks ago, and white people was mad. They were like, how dare these Black organizers and activists try to take over our environmental movement. Mm-hmm. So we can't wait. We can't wait for people to make space for us. We just have to make a place for ourselves within these various struggles, and especially the environmental movement, because we have so much at stake if and when, the climate continues to worsen. We are very, very vulnerable to the impact of climate change.
Yes, absolutely. I appreciate that. Carl, do you have anything to add before we all drop off?
I think Erica kind of said that I was thinking. One of the last things she said is that, these systems aren't malfunctioning. They're operating just the way they're designed. Mm-hmm. And that's another reason why African people need to involve themselves, because, we know firsthand that the systems are designed for us. And I think if we don't get involved, a lot of Europeans think that, they're just one bill away from getting justice, or the American government just hasn't heard the right argument, or the right ordinance hasn't been proposed yet, the right law hasn't been proposed yet. I think a lot of African people know better. And that's why I think the environmental movement specifically, but just the reason why all people should join a revolutionary organizations, because that's not true. I mean, what's going on was designed to operate this way, and we have to confront these issues in that manner and just be real about what's going on. So yeah, I think it's important that we acknowledge that and be real about our struggles, and so we can effectively plan how we're going to go about getting the work done.
No, absolutely. I appreciate that. That was a great way to end this off. But yes, I appreciate you both for coming on. You're both awesome, and this is really illuminating as well. And I think our audience thinks so as well. So yeah, appreciate you. you.